In September of 2025, Andrew Huberman, the renowned neuroscientist, sat down with Christoph Koch, and during their conversation, something astonishing emerged. It validated over a century of Carl Jung's pioneering work. Think about that for a moment. Koch revealed the existence of what he called the perception box, a neurological filter that fundamentally shapes how you experience reality, your reality. Now, here's the shocker. Spiritually awakened individuals, people who are deeply connected to something more. They have this box, well, it's not quite broken, it's more like expanded. And that's a huge reason why these folks seem to be almost vanishing from mainstream society. It's not a choice they're making. It's literally neurological. It's evolution. And Jung, Carl Jung, he mapped this territory way back in 1913. He called it individuation, the process by which a human being separates themselves from the collective unconscious and evolves into a psychologically unique individual. Think of it as becoming yourself, truly. But he also uncovered something sinister. Every single person who completed this individuation reported the same symptom: increasing isolation. They could no longer connect with society in the same old ways. It was as if they were speaking a language that no one else understood. And Jung realized this wasn't pathology. This wasn't some kind of disease or mental illness. It was the price of expanded consciousness, the cost of seeing more now. Huberman has essentially proven this, neuroscientifically. And what is the academic world doing? Mostly ignoring it. Because if this knowledge spreads, if people understand that this post-awakening isolation, it's not depression, it's not social anxiety, but rather neural rewiring, well, the whole control system, it collapses. Think about it. You stop trying to fit in. You stop mindlessly consuming solutions. You stop seeking external validation, and you become autonomous and true autonomy. That is the biggest threat to any structure, any system that relies on conformity. So let me show you exactly what Jung discovered, what Huberman confirmed in 2025, and why yes, you, listening to this right now, have probably already felt this growing disconnection. Why parties feel shallow. Why casual conversations drain your energy. Why you feel this existential loneliness, even when surrounded by people. It's not you. It's your neurology, changing. And Jung, he knew this a century ago. Back in 1913, Jung began an experiment that nearly destroyed him. He called it confrontation with the unconscious. For 3 long years, he dove headfirst into altered states of consciousness, meticulously recording everything in what became known as the Red Book. And he realized something terrifying. The deeper he went, the further he drifted away from people. His colleagues thought he was going insane. Freud himself broke with him. But Jung, he pressed on, because he was seeing the archetypes, the deep structures of the psyche that operate beneath conscious awareness. And when you see the strings that are used to manipulate you, well, you can no longer be manipulated. That is what separates you, because you see the game. While everyone else is still busy playing it, Jung called this individuation, and he described it as a process of separation from the collective. The persona, that social mask you wear to fit in, it starts to dissolve. You stop performing social roles automatically. And that creates friction, because society is built on the premise that everyone will play their assigned roles: worker, consumer, parent, child, citizen. When you stop performing these roles unconsciously, when you question the very structure of the game, you become a problem, a glitch in the system. And this is where Huberman comes in. In that September 2025 episode with Christoph Koch, they discussed something called the perception box. Koch explained that every human being has a mental box, constructed from memories, beliefs, and conditionings. This box filters all incoming information. It decides what is real, what is important, what is possible. And for most people, this box stays the same size their entire life. They might experience variations within the box, but they never question the box itself. But Koch said something crucial. Certain experiences, they expand or even break the box. Meditation, psychedelics, trauma. And when the box expands, you perceive realities that were previously invisible. Subtle energies, collective patterns, synchronicities. The problem, you try to share these new perceptions with people whose boxes haven't expanded, and to them you seem delusional because your perceptions are literally outside their reality box. This is exactly what Jung described. The individuated person sees beyond the collective persona. They perceive the shadows that society denies, structural hypocrisies, lies accepted as truth. And when you point them out, you're not greeted with gratitude. You are attacked. Because you threaten the collective comfort. People prefer a shared lie to a solitary truth. And Huberman has validated this neurologically. The brain, it's molded by social repetition. Constant exposure to the same narratives strengthens certain neural circuits. It's neuroplasticity, but it's also imprisonment. The more you reinforce the same old circuits, the harder it becomes to think outside of them. You lose the ability to imagine alternatives. And here's the brutal connection. When you go through individuation, when your perception box expands, you are literally restructuring your brain. You're weakening those old connections that kept you aligned with the collective and creating new connections that allow you to think independently. But this process, it comes with a cost. During the rewiring, you experience disconnection. Because the old ways of connecting with people, they don't work anymore. But the new ways, they aren't fully formed yet. You are in a neurological limbo. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, the period of profound isolation that every individuated person goes through. And he warned that many people give up at this stage. They crawl back into the collective box because the isolation is just too unbearable. They suppress their new perceptions. They conform once again to those old social roles, and they pretend that the awakening never even happened. And functionally, for their nervous system, it's as if it never did. The neural connections that were forming dissolve. The perception box shrinks back to its previous size, and they become indistinguishable from the mass once again. But some, they don't go back. These are the ones who complete the neural rewiring. They develop new ways of perceiving reality, and when that happens, they physically can no longer operate within those old social structures. Parties cause fatigue. Trivial conversations seem empty. Corporate environments suffocate, and they withdraw, not out of arrogance, but out of neurological incompatibility. And science confirms this. In 2024, Marjorie Woolacott, she researched transformative spiritual experiences with a grant of $7.2 million. She discovered that genuine spiritual awakening changes the prefrontal cortex. It gets thicker, more dense with neurons. But here's the crucial part. The left inferior parietal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for your sense of self and ego boundaries, shows significantly decreased activity. This explains everything. Less parietal activity means ego dissolution. You feel less separation between yourself and the world. You become more permeable, a blessing and a curse. You feel a profound connection with existence itself, but they lose the ability to maintain normal social boundaries. Carl Jung described this as the distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is your social identity, your persona. The self is your psychic totality. An individuation is the process of transferring the center of psychological gravity from the ego to the self. But when you do that, your social behavior changes. You stop protecting yourself in the same ways. You stop performing status. You stop competing for validation. And to most people, this looks like weakness or naivete or a lack of ambition because they are still operating from the ego. And the ego interprets the absence of defensiveness as vulnerability to be exploited. And that's why spiritually awakened individuals drift away, not because they're better, but because they're incompatible. It's like trying to run 2025 software on a 1990 computer. The protocols don't align, the languages don't translate. Enforcing compatibility causes system overload. So the awakened person does the only rational thing. They withdraw. They seek out other people who have also gone through neural rewiring, and when they find those people, the connection is instantaneous because they're operating on the same expanded protocol. But here's the problem. These people are rare. Statistically, less than 5% of the population goes through complete individuation. So the awakened person can spend months, years, without finding someone who truly understands. And in the meantime, the isolation can become pathological. It can turn into depression, anxiety, even suicidal ideation. Because humans are social animals, we need connection to survive. And when authentic connection isn't available, the nervous system goes into threat mode. And here's where academia fails completely. When an awakened person seeks help, describing their isolation, their sense of not belonging, their social fatigue, what does conventional psychology do? It diagnoses social anxiety disorder. It prescribes antidepressants. It recommends cognitive behavioral therapy to normalize distorted thoughts. Essentially, it tries to force the person back into the collective box. Because the medical model doesn't recognize spiritual awakening as a valid category, it pathologizes transcendence. Andrew Huberman will never say this explicitly because he works within academia, but the tools he offers, meditation, sun exposure, controlled breathing, cold exposure, all of these practices expand the perception box. They induce neuroplasticity. They weaken the old connections and create new ones. And he knows this because he studied Carl Jung. He understands that biological optimization is only half the equation. The other half is psychological integration. And without the Jungian language, without the map of the archetypes, people get lost. They optimize their bodies, but neglect their psyches. And eventually, the psyche demands its due. Through collapse, through existential crisis, through the dark night of the soul. And when that happens, when the optimized person suddenly finds themselves in psychological disintegration, they go back to Carl Jung, because Carl Jung is the only one who explains what's happening. He's the only one who says, this isn't pathology, this is transformation, you're not breaking, you're being reborn. But rebirth requires the death of the old self, and the death of the old self looks and feels like real death, because neurologically it is death. Connections that have defined your identity for decades are dissolving. It's terrifying, and no one prepared you for it. So, spiritually awakened individuals disappear. They stop updating social media. They stop going to events. They stop maintaining superficial friendships. And from the outside, it looks like depression, self-imposed isolation, But from the inside, it's careful curation of energy, because they've realized that most social interactions drain more energy than they generate, and they have a more important mission now: to complete individuation, to integrate the shadow, to develop the self. And that requires solitude, time, space, things that modern society considers luxuries, but that Carl Jung considered necessities. And here's the truth that no one wants to hear. Society doesn't want you to individuate, because individuals aren't controllable in the same way as masses. Individuals question, resist, create alternatives, and power systems depend on conformity. So there are massive structural incentives to keep people inside the collective box. Media that promotes singular narratives, education that punishes divergent thinking, a work culture that glorifies sacrifice and conformity. All of this keeps the perception box small, because small boxes are predictable, and predictability is control. Carl Jung saw this. He lived through 2 world wars. He saw how masses of people could be manipulated by collective archetypes, how entire nations could fall into psychological possession. And he realized that the only defense against collective possession is individuation. If you know your own archetypes, if you've integrated your own shadow, you can't be easily manipulated by the collective archetypes. You become immune to propaganda, to manufactured fears, to simplistic narratives of good versus evil, because you've seen the complexity within you. And that complexity vaccinates you against external simplicity. But this immunity has a cost. Loneliness, because most people still operate by collective archetypes. They still need clear enemies, simple heroes, comfortable narratives. And when you don't participate in those narratives, when you refuse archetypal roles, you become undefinable, and what is undefinable is scary. So people avoid you, not maliciously, but unconsciously, because you destabilize their certainty. And that's how spiritually awakened people disappear, not dramatically, but gradually. They stop being invited, stop being sought out, stop being remembered, because they no longer fit into the categories that people use to organize relationships. And eventually, they exist in a liminal space, not completely outside society, but definitely not within. And in that liminal space, something interesting happens. They start to find each other, not through social media, not through organized events, but through synchronicity. Carl Jung discovered that individuated people experience synchronicities with increased frequency, meaningful coincidences that seem orchestrated by some invisible intelligence. And Andrew Huberman, through Christoph Koch, validated the mechanism. The brain's salience network, the area that detects relevant patterns, becomes hyperactive in states of expanded consciousness. You literally notice connections that other people don't notice. And when you act on those connections, when you follow the synchronicities, you find the right people, the right resources, the right opportunities, not through linear effort, but through non-linear flow. And that's the part that productive society hates, because non-linear flow can't be quantified. It can't be optimized. It can't be sold as a product. It's anti-metric, anti-systematic, and therefore anti-capitalist. Because capitalism depends on measurable effort, generating predictable results, but spiritually awakened individuals operate differently. They work in cycles, periods of intense action, followed by periods of deep integration. And during those integration periods, they seem unproductive, but it's during these periods that the transformation happens, that new neural connections solidify, when insights integrate, when the next phase of action becomes clear. But try explaining that to a manager. Try justifying why you need 3 months of integration. Try saying that you're in psychological death and rebirth. You'll get fired, or worse, medicated. Because the system has no category for what you're experiencing, and what has no category is treated as dysfunction. So spiritually awakened individuals learn to hide. They develop a functional persona for necessary social interactions. But that persona is increasingly performative, increasingly exhausting, until one day they simply stop. They stop performing and they disappear. And here's the protocol that no one teaches you. The hybrid Jung-Huberman protocol for navigating post-awakening isolation. First phase, accept that you've changed neurologically. Your brain literally operates differently now. You're not going back to normal. Normal was the small perception box. You've expanded. And expansion is not reversible. So stop trying to fit into small spaces. Stop forcing connections that drain you. Accept that you need fewer connections, but deeper ones. Second phase, optimize your biology to support the neural rewiring. This is where Huberman comes in. Morning sunlight exposure to synchronize your circadian rhythm. Resistance training to boost BDNF. Daily meditation to strengthen targeted neuroplasticity. Cold exposure to train resilience to discomfort. These aren't optional, because your nervous system is under immense stress during individuation. If you don't strengthen the biological foundation, you'll collapse. Third phase, daily active imagination. This is the Jungian technique that Huberman doesn't mention, but that's critical. Every day, 20 minutes, you sit in silence and allow images to arise spontaneously from the psyche. You don't direct, you observe, and you record. Because during individuation, contents of the collective unconscious are constantly emerging. If you don't create a container for them, they'll flood you. They become symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, intrusive thoughts. But if you create a structured space for them to emerge, they become allies, guides, insights. Fourth phase, find at least one person who understands. It doesn't have to be in person. It can be online. It can be through the creative work of someone you've never met. But you need at least one reference point that validates that you're not going crazy, because the collective gaslighting is real. When everyone around you operates from a small perception box and you try to talk about experiences from the expanded one, you start to doubt yourself. You need at least one voice that says, I see what you see, I feel what you feel. You're not alone. Fifth phase, document everything. Jung kept the red book. You need the equivalent. Not to publish, not to share, but for yourself, because the journey of individuation is non-linear. You'll have moments of profound clarity, followed by periods of total confusion. And when you're confused, you need to be able to go back to those moments of clarity. Read your own words. See that you've been here before and that you got through it. That creates psychological resilience, confidence in the process. And sixth phase, accept the rhythm of synchronicity. You can't force authentic connections. You can't accelerate the process. You can only become available to it. And availability means intentional solitude. Because when you're constantly distracted by superficial connections, you don't notice when deep connections appear. Synchronicity requires attention, and attention requires space. So, create space, even if it's scary, even if everyone says you're isolating too much. They're judging from inside their perception box. You're operating from an expanded one. The rules are different. Now let me show you exactly how Huberman validated this neurologically without ever using the word individuation. In the episode with Christoph Koch, they discuss something called the default mode network, the brain's resting network. This is the network that's active when you're not focused on any specific task, when you're daydreaming, wandering. And Koch explained that this network is responsible for the sense of self. It creates and maintains your identity narrative, the story of who you are. And here's the shocker. During deep meditation, during flow states, during psychedelic experiences, the default mode network diminishes dramatically. And when it diminishes, the fixed sense of self disappears. You experience what Koch calls boundary dissolution, but what Carl Jung would call union with the self. It's the same experience, described in different languages, and both agree that this experience is transforming, because when you feel the dissolution of the ego, even temporarily, you can never completely believe in the ego's narrative again. And that changes how you interact with society, because society is built on egos performing roles. When you realize that the ego is a construct, a story you tell yourself, you stop investing in the performance. You stop competing for symbolic status because you've seen through the symbolism, and people feel that. They feel that you're not playing the game, and that discomforts them because the game only works if everyone pretends it's real. When someone stops pretending, the illusion becomes visible, and no one wants to see the illusion. So you're excluded, not officially. No one holds a meeting to decide to exclude you, but it happens organically. Because systems self-regulate, they expel elements that don't contribute to the system's cohesion, and you, with your expanded perception box, with your weakened default mode network, with your fluid ego, you no longer contribute to that cohesion. You're a disruption, so the system expels you and you disappear. And here's what Carl Jung saw that few others do. This disappearance isn't failure, it's success. Because the goal of individuation isn't to fit better into society, it's to transcend the need to fit in. It's about developing an internal center of gravity so strong that external validation becomes irrelevant. And when you achieve that, when you genuinely no longer need collective approval, you become free. But true freedom is lonely, because few choose to pay the price. And the price is high. Carl Jung almost went insane. He lost colleagues, his reputation, psychological security. For years, he wasn't sure if he'd come back, but he did come back. And he brought a map of the psyche that generations later, we're still trying to fully understand. And the map says, if you want to become who you really are, you have to stop being who you think you are, and that process will isolate you. But on the other side of that isolation, there's something most people never achieve: total authenticity. And here's where Andrew Huberman contributes, perhaps without even realizing it. All his protocols, dopamine optimization, cortisol regulation, testosterone maximization, all of that strengthens the nervous system. And you need a strong nervous system to get through individuation, because individuation is intense neurological stress. You're literally reorganizing brain structures that have been formed over decades. This isn't a gentle process. It's painful. And if your body isn't optimized, if your biological foundations are weak, you won't make it. You'll collapse back into old patterns. So here's the synthesis that few realize. Use Andrew Huberman's protocols to build an unshakable biological foundation. Sunlight exposure, exercise, sleep, nutrition, everything optimized. But don't stop there, because an optimized body without an integrated psyche is just an efficient animal. Use Carl Jung's map to navigate the psychological territory. Identify your complexes, confront your shadow, integrate your archetypes, and use Andrew Huberman's tools to keep the biology stable while the psychology transforms. Because here's what no one tells you. You can do everything right biologically and still collapse psychologically. Because biological optimization increases energy, and increased energy without psychological direction becomes destructive. You become hyperproductive, but existentially empty. You achieve goals, but don't feel fulfillment, because you optimized the vehicle, but forgot to ask where you were driving. And eventually, the psyche rebels. It forces a crisis, burnout, depression, loss of meaning, because it's screaming. Stop optimizing and start integrating. And when you finally listen, when you stop and ask, who am I really? Not who I perform to be, but who I am when no one's looking. When all the masks fall away, you initiate individuation. And from there, the disappearing becomes inevitable, because you can't be authentic and popular, not in a society that values conformity. You have to choose acceptance or authenticity, belonging or becoming, and most choose belonging, because humans are social animals. Exclusion is death on an instinctive level, but some people choose becoming. And those are the ones who disappear. And Carl Jung promised that on the other side, there's something better than superficial acceptance. There's an encounter with people who also chose authenticity. And those encounters are rare, but they're profound in a way that connections based on conformity never can be. Because when two individuated people meet, there are no games, there are no masks, there's just presence. And pure presence is what every human being secretly longs for, but few experience, and Andrew Huberman has even validated this. Christoph Koch talked about neural resonance. When two people are genuinely present with each other, their brainwaves start to synchronize, literally. You can measure it with an EEG, and that synchronization creates a feeling of connection that goes beyond words. It's connection at the nervous system level. And it's addictive, because it's what connection should be, but rarely is. Because most social interactions happen through personas, and personas can't synchronize, only authentic beings can. So here's the ultimate truth. Spiritually awakened individuals aren't disappearing because they're depressed. They're disappearing because they're evolving. They're migrating to a new protocol of existence, a protocol that mainstream society doesn't yet recognize. And in that migration, there's temporary isolation, but it's not permanent isolation. It's a period of transition, like a larva becoming a butterfly. The larva has to isolate itself in the cocoon. It has to dissolve completely before emerging transformed. And you, if you're listening to this and recognizing your own experience in these words, you're in the cocoon. And it's scary, because dissolution feels like death. But it's not. It's metamorphosis. And Carl Jung guarantees you'll emerge. Andrew Huberman guarantees your brain is reorganizing in beneficial ways. And I guarantee that the isolation isn't permanent. It's just the dark night before the dawn of a way of existing that you never even imagined was possible. And if you've made it this far, if you've absorbed this connection between Carl Jung and Andrew Huberman, between depth psychology and neuroscience, you've realized something. This knowledge has been suppressed. Not maliciously, but systemically, because academia separates disciplines. Psychology doesn't talk to neuroscience. Spirituality is exiled, and in the process, we lose the synthesis. We lose the understanding that we're simultaneously biological animals, psychological beings, and spiritual creatures. And optimizing only one dimension leaves the others starving, and producing content that unites these dimensions, that shows the connections that academia hides. It costs research. It costs the risk of being labeled pseudo-scientific. It costs facing criticism from both sides. Scientific types say Carl Jung is too mystical. Mystics say Andrew Huberman is too reductionist. And trying to build the bridge between the two is to be attacked by both sides. But the bridge needs to be built because people are suffering in the gap between them. And that's why Super Thanks exists. It's not just financial support. It's a vote. It's you saying, keep building bridges, keep revealing connections that academia fragmented, keep translating Carl Jung into neuroscientific language, keep showing that Andrew Huberman is rediscovering what Carl Jung mapped. Because when you click the golden heart, you're not just supporting a creator, you're funding the synthesis, you're investing in the reunification of knowledge that was artificially separated. And that reunification isn't academic, it's personal. Because you need it, because you're living in the gap, and you need the map that connects both sides. So if this revelation has helped you, if you finally understand why you're disappearing and that there's nothing wrong with you, consider Super Thanks, not as a favor, but as an investment in the continuation of this synthesis, because the next video, it's gonna dive even deeper. It's gonna reveal even more hidden connections. And every Super Thanks, every single one, ensures that I can keep doing this, instead of having to crank out generic algorithm-chasing content. And now, the question that defines everything. Are you disappearing or evolving? Because from the outside, they can look the same. Isolation, disconnection, withdrawal. But from the inside, the difference is everything. Disappearing is collapse, evolution is metamorphosis. And the only way to know which one it is to check if you're doing the work. Are you confronting your shadow? Are you integrating complexes? Are you optimizing your biology? Are you documenting the journey? Or are you just reactively isolating because it hurts to connect? Because reactive isolation is escape, but intentional isolation is a sacred container for transformation. Carl Jung differentiated clearly. He called reactive isolation inflation. You feel too special to relate to ordinary people. That's spiritual ego, and it's a dangerous trap. Because it looks like individuation, but it's just ego in disguise. True individuation includes humility. You realize that everyone's in the same process, just at different stages. So you don't feel superior, you feel compassionate and patient and willing to connect when the connection is authentic, even if it's rare. So go down to the comments now and answer honestly. Without judging yourself, just answer. Are you consciously evolving or reactively disappearing? Because if it's conscious, you have a protocol. You know you're in the cocoon and you expect to emerge. But if it's reactive, if you're isolating because it hurts, without doing the inner work, you need to adjust. Because isolation without integration is just loneliness, and loneliness without purpose kills. Carl Jung gives you the map, Andrew Huberman gives you the tools, but you have to walk the path. No one can do it for you. And the path passes through the valley of solitude, but on the other side of that valley, there's a way to exist that most people never even know, where you don't have to perform, where connections are deep or they don't exist, where synchronicity replaces forced effort, where your nervous system isn't constantly in social threat mode, where you finally breathe and say, so that's it. That's what authenticity feels like. And when you get there, when you complete individuation, something strange happens. You stop disappearing, not because you go back to mainstream society, but because you find your tribe. The other people who've also completed the process, and you create something new. Not a society like the old one, but small communities based on authenticity, not conformity. And these communities are emerging silently out of the spotlight, but they're growing because more people are individuating than ever before. The collective perception box is breaking, and those who step out first might seem lonely, but they're paving the way. And Andrew Huberman knows this. Christoph Koch knows this. Why else would they talk about expansion of consciousness on a neuroscience podcast? They're planting seeds, validating experiences that academia traditionally pathologizes, saying, no, you're not crazy. Your brain is changing, and brain change generates existential change, and existential change separates you temporarily, but connects you eventually with something deeper. And Carl Jung knew this 100 years ago. He wrote that individuation isn't a journey to permanent solitude. It's a journey through solitude to authenticity, and authenticity attracts authenticity. So you don't stay alone, you just stop connecting superficially and wait for connections that deserve your energy, because now you know that your energy is limited and it's sacred, and it can't be wasted on empty performances. So yes, you are disappearing, but not permanently. You're in the cocoon, and the cocoon is dark and lonely and terrifying, but it's necessary, because what you're becoming cannot emerge without a complete dissolution of what you were. So trust the process, even when it feels like you'll never come back, even when everyone says you're losing yourself. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself, and finding yourself is terrifying because it means letting go of all the borrowed identities, all the comfortable roles, all the collective certainties, and standing naked in front of the mirror of the self and asking, who am I really? And Carl Jung promises that when you ask that question with total courage, when you dive deep enough to find the true answer, you emerge transformed. You return to the world, but not as you were before. You return as an individual. And individuals change the world because they don't follow scripts, they write new ones, and the new scripts eventually become new patterns, and new patterns become new culture, and new culture is how species evolve, one individuation at a time. So you who are disappearing, you're not the problem, you're the solution, you're the cutting edge of human evolution. You're testing a new protocol of consciousness, and it's lonely to be a pioneer, but it's necessary. Because someone has to go first, someone has to break the perception box and show that there's space beyond, and then others follow, and eventually what was marginal becomes mainstream, and what was pathologized becomes valued. And that process is happening now. You can feel it. The collective box is cracking. More people questioning, more people waking up, more people individuating. And yes, more people disappearing temporarily. But they'll be back, transformed. And when they return, they'll build something different, something that honors authenticity, something where expanded perception boxes aren't threats, they're gifts. And then, finally, awakened people won't have to disappear anymore because society will have space for them. But until then, until that future arrives, you have to go through it. You have to accept the solitude. You have to do the work. You have to trust that Carl Jung was right, that Andrew Huberman is validating, that your brain knows what it's doing, and that on the other side, there's a version of you that you can't even imagine yet. A version that's completely authentic, completely integrated, completely alive. And it's worth all the isolation to get there. Jung guarantees it, Huberman confirms it, and now you know.